The front door creaked open to silence, and I knew something was terribly wrong. I'm telling you this story because some betrayals cut so deep that they reshape your entire understanding of family, love, and what people are truly capable of when they think no one's watching. If you've ever trusted the wrong person completely, if you've ever had your world shattered by someone you'd have died for, then you'll understand every word of what I'm about to share. And please, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I need to know I'm not alone in this. My name is Sarah, and 3 years ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was the dutiful daughter who called every Sunday, the sister who never missed a birthday, the granddaughter who still sent handwritten letters because Grandma Rose preferred them over texts. I was 32, working as a nurse in Denver, and I genuinely believed that family was everything. That blood meant loyalty. That the people who raised you would never, ever betray you in ways that could destroy your soul. I was so incredibly naive. Christmas 2021 was supposed to be perfect. I'd saved up vacation days for months, bought gifts in October, and even learned how to make Grandma's famous apple pie from her handwritten recipe she'd mailed me in September. I was driving from Denver to my childhood home in Cedar Falls, Iowa, humming along to Christmas music and actually feeling hopeful about life for the first time in years. The divorce from Marcus had been finalized 6 months earlier, and I was finally starting to feel like myself again. The therapy was helping. The antidepressants were working. I'd even started dating again. Nothing serious, but enough to remember that I was a person worth loving. Christmas with my family felt like the perfect way to close out a year of healing and start fresh. I pulled into the familiar gravel driveway at 2:47 p.m. on December 23rd. The house looked exactly the same as it had since childhood. White clapboard siding, green shutters, the wraparound porch where I'd spent countless summer evenings reading Nancy Drew mysteries. Mom's car wasn't in the driveway, which was odd but not alarming. She'd mentioned something about last-minute Christmas shopping when we'd spoken on Tuesday. But Dad's truck was missing too. And so was my brother Jake's beat-up Honda. I grabbed my overnight bag and the carefully wrapped presents from the back seat, balancing everything as I climbed the front steps. The Christmas wreath on the door was crooked, hanging at an angle that made the house look somehow sad. I knocked first, a lifetime of Midwest politeness, before using my key. The silence that greeted me was profound and unsettling. Not just quiet, but empty in a way that made my skin crawl. You know how a house feels different when no one's home? This was that feeling amplified, like the building itself was holding its breath. I called out as I stepped into the entryway, my voice echoing strangely in the familiar space. The living room was exactly as I remembered, same floral couch, same family photos on the mantel, same crocheted doilies that Grandma Rose insisted were classy, despite everyone else thinking they were outdated. But something felt off about the whole scene, like a movie set that's been dressed to look normal but doesn't quite succeed. The Christmas tree stood in its usual corner by the front window, but it looked sparse, almost reluctantly decorated. Half the lights weren't working, and there were far fewer presents underneath than I remembered from previous years. For a family that usually went overboard on Christmas, it looked almost abandoned. I was setting my bags down when I heard it. A soft scraping sound coming from the kitchen, like someone dragging a fork across a plate. My heart leaped with relief and maybe a little irritation. Someone was home after all, and they hadn't bothered to answer when I called out. I walked through the dining room, past the table that was set for Christmas dinner with Mom's good china, 6 place settings, which struck me as odd since there should have been 7 if I was expected, and pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen. Grandma Rose sat at the small breakfast table by the window, slowly eating what looked like turkey and mashed potatoes from a paper plate. She was wearing her favorite house dress, the blue one with tiny flowers that she'd owned for as long as I could remember, and her white hair was perfectly set despite being alone in the house. At 87, Grandma was still sharp as a tack, but she'd started forgetting small things lately, where she put her reading glasses, whether she'd taken her medications, the names of actors in old movies she'd seen dozens of times. Seeing her alone in this empty house, eating what were obviously leftovers, filled me with a confusing mix of relief and concern. She looked up when I entered, and for just a moment, I saw something flash across her face that I couldn't quite identify. Surprise, maybe, or possibly guilt. But it was gone so quickly that I wondered if I'd imagined it. Her voice was warm but tired when she spoke, and she didn't get up from her chair. She explained that everyone else had gone to see some Christmas lights display about 40 minutes away, some elaborate setup that had been featured in the local newspaper. They'd asked if she wanted to come along, but she'd been feeling tired and decided to stay home with the leftovers from yesterday's early celebration.
Wait.
Yesterday's early celebration? I felt something cold settle in my stomach as the implications hit me. I asked her to repeat what she'd said, certain I'd misheard. But no, there it was again. The family had celebrated Christmas yesterday, December 22nd, without me. The presents under the tree, the fancy place settings, the good china, it had all been used already for a celebration I hadn't been invited to. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I'd confirmed my arrival date multiple times. Mom and I had discussed the menu. Dad had specifically asked me to bring my famous chocolate chip cookies. How could they have celebrated without me? How could they have just forgotten I was coming? Grandma seemed to realize she'd said something wrong because she started backtracking, her words tumbling over each other in a way that wasn't like her at all. She insisted it hadn't been the real celebration, just a small family dinner, nothing important. The real Christmas was tomorrow, she said, when I was supposed to be there. Yesterday had just been casual, nothing special. But even as she spoke, I could see the evidence all around me. The fancy tablecloth had been washed and put away. The good serving dishes were drying in the dish rack. There were multiple dessert plates in the sink, far more than would be needed for a casual family dinner. This hadn't been some impromptu gathering. This had been Christmas, complete and whole, and I hadn't been part of it. I wanted to believe her explanations. I needed to believe them. The alternative, that my family had deliberately excluded me from Christmas, was too devastating to consider. So I forced a smile and told her not to worry about it, that I was just happy to be home. But as I sat down across from her at the small table, watching her push cold mashed potatoes around her paper plate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was happening here. Something that had nothing to do with forgotten dates or miscommunication. That's when she glanced toward the counter by the refrigerator and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there was a note for me. Mom had left it that morning before they all went out to see the lights. The envelope sat propped against the coffee maker, my name written across it in Mom's familiar handwriting. It looked innocuous enough, just a piece of white paper folded in half and tucked into one of the envelopes from the stationery set I'd given her last Mother's Day. I should have left it there. I should have waited until everyone came home, until we could all sit down together and talk through whatever misunderstanding had led to this situation. I should have trusted that there was a reasonable explanation for all of it. Instead, I picked up that envelope, and with it, I picked up the thread that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family, my life, and myself. The paper felt heavier than it should have as I unfolded it, and Mom's words seemed to leap off the page with a cruelty that made my hands shake. I've read that letter probably 1,000 times since that December afternoon, and I can still recite every word from memory. Some things burn themselves into your brain so completely that they become part of your DNA, and betrayal, real, deep betrayal, is one of those things. The handwriting was definitely Mom's, neat and careful in the way she'd taught me to write thank you notes as a child. But the words themselves seemed to come from a stranger. Sarah. I know this isn't the way anyone wanted to handle this situation, but after long conversations with your father and Jake, we've decided it's best if you don't stay for Christmas this year. We had our celebration yesterday because, frankly, we needed time as a family without the drama and stress that seems to follow you everywhere these days. If you've ever had the ground disappear beneath your feet while you were standing perfectly still, you know exactly what that first paragraph did to me. I had to read it 3 times before the words made sense, and even then, they felt like they were written in a foreign language. Your divorce from Marcus has been difficult for all of us, not just you. The constant phone calls, the crying, the way you've made every family gathering about your problems for the past 2 years, it's exhausting. We love you, but we also deserve to have a peaceful Christmas without worrying about your emotional state. I actually laughed when I read that part. Not because it was funny, but because the alternative was screaming, and Grandma was sitting right there, still picking at her leftovers like this was a perfectly normal Tuesday afternoon. The sound that came out of me was hollow and bitter, and it made her look up with concern. Asterisk, we think you should use this time to focus on yourself and your healing. Maybe spend the holidays with friends in Denver, or take a trip somewhere relaxing. We'll plan to see you in the spring when things have settled down a bit. Asterisk. Love. Mom, Dad, and Jake. Asterisk P.S. We left some presents for you with Rose. Please don't make a scene about this in front of her. She doesn't need the stress at her age. Asterisk. I must have sat there for 10 full minutes, just staring at those words. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear a neighbor's dog barking. Normal sounds of a normal day, except my entire world had just imploded. The cruelest part wasn't even the rejection itself, it was how they'd framed it. They'd made my pain into an inconvenience, my grief into selfishness, my need for family support during the worst period of my life into a burden they no longer wanted to carry. And they'd done it all while wrapping it in language that made it sound like they were doing me a favor. Grandma was watching me carefully now, and I could see in her eyes that she knew exactly what that letter said. She'd probably watched Mom write it. Maybe she'd even been part of the conversation where they'd decided that Christmas was better without me. When I asked her if she'd known about this, her silence was answer enough. She set down her fork and reached across the table to pat my hand, the gesture so familiar and comforting that it made everything worse. She tried to explain that it hadn't been her decision, that she'd argued against it, but ultimately, it was their house and their choice. She'd been outvoted, she said. And what was she supposed to do? She was 87 years old and depended on them for everything from grocery shopping to doctor's appointments. She couldn't exactly rebel against the people who controlled every aspect of her daily life. I understood the logic, but understanding didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. Grandma Rose had been my ally my entire life, the one person who always took my side, who always made me feel valued and heard. Learning that she'd known about this plan and hadn't warned me felt like losing my last safe harbor in a storm I hadn't even seen coming. But here's what made it worse. The letter was dated December 20th. 3 days ago. That meant they'd made this decision, and Mom had written this cruel dismissal while I was in Denver, excitedly wrapping their Christmas presents and practicing her apple pie recipe. While I was looking forward to seeing them, they were planning how to get rid of me. The presents I'd brought suddenly felt like evidence of my own stupidity. I'd spent nearly $400 on gifts for people who didn't want me there. I'd used precious vacation days to travel 8 hours to visit family members who thought I was too much trouble to tolerate during the holidays. I asked Grandma how long they'd been planning this, and her hesitation told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a last-minute decision made in a moment of frustration. This had been discussed, debated, and decided over time. They'd had multiple conversations about me, about my problems, about how much easier their Christmas would be without my presence. The details started coming out then, slowly and reluctantly, like pulling teeth. Jake had apparently been the most vocal about wanting me excluded, claiming that I'd ruined Thanksgiving with my sadness about the divorce. Mom had initially resisted, but Dad had supported Jake's position. They'd ultimately reached a consensus that my emotional neediness was too much to handle during what should be a joyful time. They'd celebrated Christmas on December 22nd with all the traditions we'd maintained since childhood, Dad's famous eggnog, the Christmas Eve service at the Lutheran church, the elaborate gift exchange that always took up most of the morning. They'd carried on as if I'd never existed, and probably enjoyed it more without having to worry about my feelings. Grandma mentioned, almost as an aside, that they'd made a point of not posting any photos on Facebook. They didn't want me to see evidence of what I'd missed. Even their celebration had been calculated to avoid hurting me, which somehow made it hurt more. I wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. Yes, my divorce had been difficult. Yes, I needed more emotional support than usual over the past 2 years. But I was their daughter, their sister. Wasn't that what family was supposed to do? Support each other through the hard times? Wasn't that the whole point of having people who loved you unconditionally? Apparently not. Apparently, there were conditions I hadn't known about. Apparently, my pain had an expiration date, and I'd exceeded it without anyone bothering to tell me. The worst part was realizing how many signs I'd missed. Phone calls that had been shorter than usual. Conversations that felt stilted and awkward. Mom's vague responses when I'd asked about Christmas plans. Jake's complete silence for the past month, which I'd attributed to his busy work schedule. They hadn't just excluded me from Christmas. They'd been pulling away for months, and I'd been too caught up in my own healing to notice. I sat in that kitchen, holding a letter that had destroyed my understanding of my place in the world, and tried to figure out what to do next. I could confront them when they returned from seeing the Christmas lights, but what was the point? They'd already made their feelings clear. I could make a scene, demand explanations, force them to defend their decision. But that would only confirm their belief that I was too dramatic, too needy, too much trouble to be worth including. Or I could leave quietly, the way they obviously hoped I would, and pretend this had never happened. I could drive back to Denver, spend Christmas alone in my empty apartment, and maybe by New Year's we could all pretend this was just a misunderstanding. But as I looked at Grandma Rose, still wearing that blue house dress, still picking at her cold leftovers, still trapped in a house where she had no real power despite being the matriarch of our family, I realized there was a third option. I could stay. I could make them face what they'd done. And I could make sure they understood exactly what kind of pain they'd chosen to inflict on someone who had loved them unconditionally her entire life. The letter had changed everything, but it had also given me something I hadn't had in months, a clear sense of purpose. They wanted drama? They thought I was exhausting? They believed I made everything about me? Well, they were about to find out what that really looked like. What I discovered next made the letter seem like a gentle suggestion in comparison. I stayed in that kitchen with Grandma for another hour, and, during that time, she told me things that made me question everything I thought I knew about my family. If you've ever had someone you trust reveal that your entire reality was built on lies, you'll understand why I'm still processing what she shared with me that afternoon. It started when I asked her why Jake had been so adamant about excluding me. I expected her to mention the divorce again, maybe some complaint about how I'd monopolized conversation during recent visits. What I didn't expect was for her face to go completely pale before she looked toward the window, as if making sure no one was coming up the driveway. She told me she probably shouldn't say anything, that it wasn't her place, but she was tired of keeping secrets. At 87, she said, she was too old to protect people from truths they needed to know. Jake hadn't wanted me at Christmas because he was afraid I'd figure out what he'd been doing. For the past 6 months, while I'd been calling him for brother-sister support during my divorce, while I'd been confiding in him about my struggles with Marcus and the counseling and the loneliness, Jake had been talking to Marcus behind my back. Not just talking, actively maintaining a friendship that had started years before my marriage fell apart. I need you to understand how devastating this was. Jake had been my closest confidant through the entire divorce process. He'd been the one who encouraged me to leave Marcus when I first discovered the emotional affairs. He'd been the shoulder I cried on when the lawyers made everything ugly and complicated. He'd been the person who assured me I was making the right choice, that I deserved better, that he'd always be there for me no matter what. And all along, he'd been texting my ex-husband, sharing drinks with him, playing basketball at the gym with him every Thursday night like nothing had changed. Grandma's voice dropped to almost a whisper as she told me this, and I could see how much it had been weighing on her. She'd accidentally discovered it a month ago when Jake left his phone on her kitchen table and it had buzzed with a text from Marcus. She'd seen enough of the conversation to understand that this wasn't a recent development. They'd been staying in touch throughout my entire separation and divorce. But it got worse. So much worse. Marcus had been telling Jake details about our marriage that I'd never shared with anyone. Private things about our relationship, our intimacy, our fights, our hopes for children that had never materialized. Jake knew about the miscarriage I'd had in 2019, the one I'd only told Marcus about, the one that had started the slow unraveling of our marriage when he'd seemed relieved rather than grieved. Jake knew about the night I'd found evidence of Marcus's emotional affair with his coworker. Jake knew about the marriage counseling sessions where Marcus had blamed me for being too needy and emotionally demanding. All of these private details of my pain had been shared between my ex-husband and my brother like gossip, like entertainment, like I was some pathetic character in a story they both found amusing. I had to excuse myself to use the bathroom because I was going to be sick. I sat on the cold tile floor of the bathroom where I'd learned to put on makeup as a teenager, where I'd hidden to cry after bad breakups in high school, and tried to process what I'd just learned. My brother, my protector, my ally, the person who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with algebra and walked me down the aisle when Dad had gotten food poisoning on my wedding day, had been betraying me in the most intimate way possible. He'd been sharing my secrets, my vulnerabilities, my deepest pain with the person who'd caused most of it. When I came back to the kitchen, Grandma had more to tell me. Mom and Dad knew about Jake's friendship with Marcus. They'd known for months. In fact, they'd encouraged it, believing that maintaining a relationship with Marcus would help them understand both sides of the divorce. They'd been getting regular updates on how I was doing in therapy, what I was saying about them in my sessions, whether I was dating anyone new. The phone calls I'd thought were my mother checking on my emotional well-being? She'd already known everything I was going to tell her because Marcus had told Jake, and Jake had told them. My updates about therapy progress, my small victories, my bad days, my hopeful moments, they'd all been old news by the time I shared them. I was a character in a story being told about me by people who were supposed to love me, to people who had no right to know the intimate details of my healing process. Grandma kept apologizing as she told me all of this, saying she should have spoken up sooner, that she should have found a way to warn me. But she was trapped in her own way, dependent on my parents for everything, afraid of being seen as a troublemaker at an age when she had few options for independence. She told me about conversations she'd overheard, discussions about my emotional instability and whether I needed professional help beyond what I was already getting. They'd been analyzing my mental health like amateur psychiatrists, using information that Marcus had obtained through our most private moments and conversations. Jake had even shared details about my current dating life. The few casual dates I'd mentioned to him, my nervousness about being intimate with someone new after 7 years of marriage, my insecurities about being attractive at 32 after a devastating divorce. All of it had been reported back to my ex-husband like intelligence from a spy in enemy territory. But here's what nearly broke me completely. Jake had been encouraging Marcus to fight for the marriage right up until the papers were finalized. While he was telling me I deserved better and that leaving was the right choice, he was telling Marcus that I was probably just going through a phase, that I still loved him, that if he was patient and persistent, I might change my mind. Jake had been sabotaging my healing while pretending to support it. He'd been undermining my confidence in my decision while acting like my biggest advocate. He'd been feeding information about my progress to the person I was trying to recover from, potentially setting me up for manipulation and continued emotional abuse. I asked Grandma why Jake would do such a thing, and her answer revealed yet another layer of betrayal I hadn't seen coming. Jake had never liked me being married to Marcus, but not for the reasons I'd thought. It wasn't because he could see that Marcus wasn't good for me. It was because he was jealous of the friendship he'd lost when I got married. Jake and Marcus had been genuine friends since college, and my marriage had complicated that relationship. When the marriage started failing, Jake saw an opportunity to have his friend back without the inconvenience of a sister-in-law who needed emotional support. Jake had been hoping the divorce would be quick and clean, that I'd move on gracefully, and that he could maintain his friendship with Marcus without any awkwardness. When it became clear that I was struggling and needed more support than he'd anticipated, when he realized that my healing process was going to be long and messy and emotionally demanding, he'd started resenting me for complicating what should have been a simple situation. My need for brother-sister support during the worst period of my life had become an inconvenience that interfered with his social life. Sitting in that kitchen, learning all of this while surrounded by the evidence of a Christmas celebration I'd been excluded from, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and confusion were still there, but they were being joined by something else, something harder and colder and more focused. Anger, yes, but more than that. A kind of crystalline clarity about who these people really were and what they actually thought of me. A understanding that the family I'd been grieving for during my divorce, the support system I thought I'd lost when I left Marcus, had never really existed in the first place. They'd been performing family for me while secretly participating in my humiliation. They'd been playing roles while I'd been genuinely loving them, trusting them, depending on them. But now I knew the truth. And as I sat there listening to Grandma's nervous apologies and watching the winter light fade through the kitchen window, I began to formulate a plan. They wanted drama? They thought I was too emotional, too needy, too much trouble? They had no idea what any of those things actually looked like. But they were about to learn. At 6:23 p.m., I heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway and knew my life was about to change forever. I'd spent the last 3 hours sitting in my childhood bedroom, staring at the collection of small, pathetic presents Grandma had shown me, clearly last-minute afterthoughts wrapped in leftover paper from the real celebration. A drugstore candle from Mom, a generic gift card from Dad, and nothing at all from Jake. Even their pity presents were insulting. But I'd also spent those 3 hours planning. If you've ever been so angry that it clarifies your thinking instead of clouding it, you know the state I was in. Every detail was sharp, every possible outcome calculated. I knew exactly what I was going to do, and exactly why I was going to do it. I heard car doors slamming, familiar voices carrying through the cold December air. Jake's laugh, the same laugh he'd probably shared with Marcus over stories about my pathetic attempts to rebuild my life. Dad's voice telling someone to grab something from the trunk. Mom's tone, artificially bright in the way it got when she was trying to manage a situation she found uncomfortable. They were home from their Christmas lights adventure, probably expecting to find me gone. The plan had likely been simple. I'd read the letter, collect my sad little presents, and disappear back to Denver with my tail between my legs. By the time they got home, this unpleasant business would be over, and they could go back to their Marcus-informed family dynamic without the inconvenience of my emotional needs. They had no idea I was still there. More importantly, they had no idea what I now knew. I heard the front door open, followed by the rustle of coats being hung up and boots being kicked off. Their voices carried easily through the old house, voices I'd been hearing my entire life, but which now sounded different somehow. Like I was listening to strangers who happened to share my DNA. Mom asked Grandma if I'd been by yet, and I could hear the hope in her voice that the answer would be no. Grandma's response was carefully neutral. She confirmed that I'd stopped by and collected the presents they'd left for me. She didn't mention that I was still in the house, and I realized she was giving me the choice of how to handle this confrontation. Jake's voice was the one that made my hands clench into fists. He sounded relieved as he said something about hoping I hadn't made a scene about the letter. Dad chuckled and made a comment about me probably driving back to Denver in tears, which seemed to amuse them both. They were laughing about my pain, actually laughing about the devastation they'd deliberately caused. That's when I decided to stop being the accommodating daughter, the understanding sister, the person who always tried to smooth over conflicts and make everyone comfortable. That version of me had died when I read Mom's letter, and the person walking down those stairs was someone entirely new. I appeared in the living room doorway, like a ghost they hadn't expected to see. The conversation stopped mid-sentence, and for a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock and someone's sharp intake of breath. Mom recovered first, her face shifting into the bright, false smile she used when she was caught in an uncomfortable situation. She started talking too fast, too cheerfully, asking if I'd had a nice drive, commenting on the cold weather, offering to make hot chocolate like this was any normal family reunion. I let her talk. I stood there in the doorway, still wearing my coat, and watched them all scramble to figure out how to handle the situation they'd created. Dad was avoiding eye contact completely, suddenly very interested in sorting through mail on the side table. Jake was staring at me with something that looked almost like fear, as if he could sense that something fundamental had changed. Finally, I spoke, and my voice was calmer than I'd expected it to be. I told them I'd read the letter. I told them I'd talk to Grandma. I told them I knew about their Christmas celebration, their conversations about my mental health, and their decision that I was too much trouble to include in family traditions I'd been part of for 32 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom started to explain, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to justify what they'd done. She talked about tough love and helping me become more independent, and how they'd thought some time alone might be good for my healing process. Everything she said made it worse because it revealed just how much thought they'd put into rationalizing their cruelty. But I wasn't done. I looked directly at Jake and told him I also knew about his friendship with Marcus. I watched his face go completely white as I described exactly what Grandma had told me. The texts, the basketball games, the sharing of my private information, the encouragement he'd been giving my ex-husband to fight for the marriage, while pretending to support my decision to leave. Jake tried to deny it at first, but I could see the truth in his eyes. When denial didn't work, he tried to justify it, claiming he'd just been trying to stay neutral, that he'd thought maintaining a friendship with Marcus might help him understand both perspectives and maybe even help us reconcile. That's when I lost what was left of my composure. I told him exactly what I thought of his neutrality, his perspective, and his help. I told him that staying friends with someone who'd emotionally abused his sister wasn't neutral, it was choosing sides. I told him that sharing my private pain with my abuser wasn't helping, it was participating in continued harm. I told him that his friendship with Marcus had cost him his relationship with me, and that it wasn't a trade I thought he'd ultimately be happy with. Dad finally spoke up, trying to play peacemaker the way he always did when family conflicts got uncomfortable. He suggested we all sit down and discuss this calmly, like adults, maybe over some of Mom's leftover Christmas cookies. I laughed, and it wasn't a sound that belonged in that living room. I told him there wasn't going to be any calm adult discussion because I wasn't planning to stay. But I also wasn't leaving quietly the way they'd hoped I would. I was leaving loudly, messily, and with complete honesty about what kind of people they'd shown themselves to be. I started with Jake, since his betrayal cut the deepest. I told him that our relationship was over, that I never wanted to speak to him again, and that he could tell Marcus I'd said hello the next time they got together for their weekly bro session. I told him that he'd chosen his friend over his sister, and that I hoped Marcus was worth losing the person who'd loved him unconditionally his entire life. Then I turned to my parents. I told them that their letter had been the cruelest thing anyone had ever said to me, and that was including everything Marcus had put me through during our divorce. I told them that they'd taken someone who was healing and growing and finding her strength again, and they tried to convince her she was too much trouble to love. I told them that was unforgivable. Mom started crying, which might have moved me 6 months earlier, but now just felt like another manipulation. She kept saying she was sorry, that they'd made a mistake, that they loved me and wanted to work through this as a family. But I was done being the person who always forgave, who always understood, who always prioritized family harmony over her own well-being. I told them that love wasn't something you could claim while actively harming someone. I told them that family wasn't a magic word that erased the consequences of deliberate cruelty. I told them that they'd made their choice when they decided to exclude me from Christmas, and I was making mine by excluding them from my life. The thing about burning bridges is that it's surprisingly liberating once you accept that you're never going back across them. I walked back upstairs, grabbed my overnight bag, and came back down to a living room full of people who suddenly understood that their actions had consequences they hadn't anticipated. As I headed for the door, Grandma Rose appeared in the hallway. She looked tired and sad, but also strangely proud. She pressed something into my hand, a small piece of paper with her phone number written on it. She told me she wanted to keep in touch with me directly, without going through my parents. She told me she was proud of me for standing up for myself, even if it meant the family would never be the same. She told me that sometimes love meant letting people face the consequences of their choices, and that's what I was doing for all of them. I hugged her goodbye, knowing it might be the last time I'd see her in that house in that context, as part of that family system that had just imploded. As I drove away, I could see them all standing in the living room window, and I wondered if they finally understood what they'd lost. Not just my presence at Christmas, but my trust, my love, my willingness to keep showing up no matter how badly they treated me. They'd wanted a Christmas without drama, without my neediness, without the inconvenience of my emotional healing. They'd gotten exactly what they asked for. Forever. The interstate stretched ahead of me like a river of darkness, broken only by the occasional flash of headlights and the green glow of exit signs I couldn't read through my tears. I wasn't driving back to Denver. That would have been the expected thing, the safe thing, the thing they'd all assumed I would do. Instead, I was driving east on I-80 with no destination in mind and a full tank of gas, running on pure adrenaline and the strange freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I'd left the house. Calls from Mom, texts from Dad, even a few attempts from Jake. I'd turned off the sound after the first 20 minutes, but I could still see the screen lighting up every few minutes, like a frantic heartbeat. I didn't answer any of them. What was there to say? They'd had months to reach out to check on me genuinely, to include me in their family. Instead, they'd chosen to analyze my mental health with my ex-husband and plan Christmas celebrations without me. Their sudden concern felt like closing the barn door after the horse had already burned the entire farm down. Somewhere around the Iowa-Illinois border, I pulled into a truck stop that looked like something from a movie about serial killers, fluorescent lights buzzing over cracked pavement, a few semis parked at angles that suggested their drivers were too tired to care about proper parking etiquette. It was exactly the kind of place my family would have been horrified to see me stop at alone, which made it feel perfect. I sat in my car for a long time, engine running, heat blasting, watching truckers shuffle between their cabs and the building like sleepwalkers. The normalcy of their routine was somehow comforting. These people had places to be, schedules to keep, people expecting them somewhere. They had purpose and direction, which was more than I could say for myself at that moment. That's when I started really processing what had happened. Not just the immediate shock and anger, but the deeper implications of what I'd learned. This hadn't been a single moment of family cruelty. This had been a systematic campaign to exclude me while maintaining the illusion that they cared about my well-being. The divorce from Marcus had been devastating, but it had also been honest in its devastation. He'd stopped pretending to love me, stopped pretending to want our marriage to work, stopped pretending to be someone he wasn't. It had hurt like hell, but at least it had been real. What my family had done was worse because it had been disguised as love. They'd been telling me they supported my healing, while secretly believing I was too broken to tolerate. They'd been encouraging my independence while sharing my private struggles with the person I was trying to heal from. They'd been playing the role of caring family members while actively planning to exclude me from the traditions that had shaped my entire understanding of home and belonging. If you've ever realized that people you trusted completely were performing care rather than feeling it, you know why I sat in that truck stop parking lot and cried until my chest hurt. But somewhere between the tears and the truckers and the buzzing fluorescent lights, something else started happening. I started getting angry again, but this time it wasn't the hot, desperate anger I'd felt in their living room. This was something colder, more calculated, more purposeful. They thought they knew me. They thought they understood what I was capable of, what I would tolerate, how I would respond to their betrayal. Jake thought I'd retreat into my depression and maybe need more therapy. Mom thought I'd eventually forgive them because that's what I'd always done before. Dad thought I'd come around once I'd had time to see their perspective and understand that they'd been trying to help me. They were all wrong, and their wrongness was about to become a very expensive mistake. I pulled out my phone and started making a list. Not of people to call or places to go, but of information I had that they wouldn't want other people to know. Secrets they'd shared with me over the years, assuming I'd always be the safe, loyal daughter who would never use family information against them. Jake's secret credit card debt that he'd hidden from his wife, Ashley, for 3 years. The gambling problem he developed during the pandemic that had nearly cost him his house. His emotional affair with his coworker Rachel that had never turned physical, but had definitely crossed emotional boundaries that would destroy his marriage if Ashley knew about it. Dad's tax issues from his contracting business, the corners he'd cut and the cash payments he'd failed to report that could get him in serious trouble if the IRS decided to take a closer look. His drinking problem that had gotten worse since he'd turned 60, the DUI he'd gotten last year that Mom had helped him cover up by claiming she'd been driving when the insurance company asked questions about the damaged car. Mom's prescription drug habit that had started with legitimate back pain and had evolved into something much more serious. The pills she'd been getting from multiple doctors, the way she'd been using my nursing knowledge to help her manage the combinations, the times I'd covered for her when she'd been too impaired to function at family gatherings, but everyone had attributed it to fatigue or stress. They'd all trusted me with these secrets because they believed I was safe, that my love for them was unconditional, that my loyalty to family was absolute. They'd been right about all of those things, until they decided to weaponize my vulnerability and exclude me from the family I'd been protecting. Now those secrets felt like ammunition, and I was no longer interested in protecting people who had deliberately chosen to harm me. But I wasn't going to use the information immediately. That would be too obvious, too easily traced back to our confrontation. No, this was going to take time and planning and patience. The kind of revenge that unfolds slowly, that builds consequences gradually, that gives people plenty of time to realize what's happening and why, but not enough time to stop it. I started making phone calls, but not to my family. I called my supervisor at the hospital in Denver and requested extended leave under the Family Medical Leave Act. I had plenty of legitimate reasons: the stress of the divorce, the depression I'd been managing, the family crisis I was now dealing with. She approved it immediately, knowing I'd never asked for anything like this before, and trusting that I wouldn't abuse the system. Then I called my landlord and arranged to sublet my apartment for the next 3 months. I called my bank and moved money around, making sure I had access to funds without needing to maintain a permanent address for a while. I was methodically dismantling my normal life, creating space for whatever came next. The thing about rock bottom is that it's actually a very solid place to build from, once you accept that you're there. By the time I left that truck stop, I had a plan. Not just for revenge, but for reconstruction. I was going to take apart the family that had decided I was disposable, but I was also going to build something new for myself. Something that didn't depend on their approval, their inclusion, or their version of love. I drove through the night, following interstate highways that took me further and further from everything familiar. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I was driving towards something instead of just away from it. My phone kept buzzing with their increasingly frantic calls and messages, but I didn't even look at it anymore. They'd made their choice when they'd written that letter and planned that celebration and decided I was too much trouble to love unconditionally. Now I was making mine. 6 weeks later, I was living in a furnished studio apartment in Minneapolis, working as a travel nurse at Methodist Hospital and slowly, methodically, destroying my family's comfortable lives. If you've ever had to rebuild your entire life from scratch while simultaneously plotting revenge against the people who made it necessary, you'll understand why those first few weeks felt like living in someone else's story. Every day was simultaneously ordinary and surreal. I'd go to work, take care of patients, grab coffee with new colleagues, and then come home and spend hours researching private investigators, public records, and the kind of information that becomes very expensive when it falls into the wrong hands. The beauty of being a nurse is that you learn to compartmentalize. You can hold space for someone's pain in the morning, maintain professional composure through a medical crisis in the afternoon, and then go home and plan something that would horrify your coworkers if they knew about it. It's all about managing what you let yourself feel, and when you let yourself feel it. My new life in Minneapolis was surprisingly peaceful. The anonymity was liberating. Nobody knew about my divorce, my family drama, or my emotional breakdown. I was just Sarah, the competent travel nurse from Denver who was pleasant to work with and kept to herself. I made casual friends, went to movies alone, discovered restaurants I liked, and slowly began to remember who I was when I wasn't trying to manage other people's feelings about my existence. But every evening, I'd come home to my small apartment and work on my other project. It started with Jake, because his betrayal had been the most personal and his secrets were the most immediately actionable. I'd done some research and found that his wife, Ashley, had been posting on social media about their recent vacation to Cancun, their new furniture purchases, and her excitement about finally being able to start trying for kids now that their finances were finally stable. She had no idea that Jake had been hiding significant gambling debts and credit card debt that made their financial stability a complete fiction. The gambling addiction had gotten worse than even I had known. Through some careful investigation and a private investigator who specialized in financial infidelity cases, I discovered that Jake had been borrowing against his 401k, taking cash advances on credit cards Ashley didn't know about, and had even taken out a second mortgage on their house without her knowledge. Ashley deserved to know what she was married to, especially before she brought children into the situation. I didn't contact her directly. That would have been too obvious and too easily traced back to me. Instead, I created an anonymous email account and sent her copies of financial documents that were public record, along with screenshots of Jake's activity on gambling websites and dating apps. Yes, dating apps. That had been a surprise even to me, but apparently his emotional affair with Rachel had evolved into him actively looking for other opportunities to cheat. I didn't include any personal commentary or emotional appeals. I just provided the evidence and let her draw her own conclusions about what kind of man she was married to and whether she wanted to build a future with someone who was capable of that level of deception. Ashley filed for divorce 3 weeks later. Jake called me 17 times that day, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails that ranged from pleading to threatening. He knew exactly who had provided Ashley with that information, even if he couldn't prove it. I never called him back, but I did send him a single text message. Now you know how it feels to have your private pain shared with people who use it against you. The difference is, Ashley deserved to know the truth. Marcus didn't deserve to know mine. That was the only direct communication I had with any of them for months. The work on my parents took longer because their secrets were more complex and the consequences needed to be more carefully orchestrated. Dad's tax issues required a different approach. I couldn't just send anonymous information to the IRS. That would have been too obviously vindictive and might have backfired legally. Instead, I focused on the cash payments he'd been accepting for contracting work without reporting them as income. I started casually mentioning his business practices to people who might eventually need contracting work, always in the context of how expensive legitimate contractors were and how some people cut costs by paying cash to avoid taxes. Word travels fast in small communities, especially when it concerns people potentially breaking the law in ways that could get their customers in trouble too. Within a month, Dad's business was struggling as former clients started worrying about their own liability for participating in tax evasion, even unknowingly. For Mom's prescription drug problem, I took a more direct medical approach. I contacted the state prescription monitoring program and provided them with evidence of doctor shopping and potential prescription fraud. I also reached out to her primary care physician with concerns about potential drug interactions and polypharmacy issues, couching my information in the language of worried daughter who'd noticed concerning changes in her mother's behavior and cognitive function. The medical board investigation that followed was thorough and professional. Mom lost access to several of her pill sources and was required to enter addiction treatment if she wanted to continue receiving legitimate medical care. It probably saved her life, even though she would never see it that way. The beautiful thing about consequences is that they feel like justice when they're proportional to the harm that was caused. My family had participated in my emotional abuse, shared my private information with my abuser, and systematically excluded me from their lives while pretending it was for my own good. Now they were experiencing their own systematic exclusion from financial security, from marriage, from the comfortable lies they'd built their lives on. The difference was their consequences were based on actual harm they'd done to other people, not just the inconvenience of loving someone who was struggling. But the real masterstroke was still to come. Through my research, I discovered something that made all their other secrets look like minor indiscretions. Something that would destroy not just their individual lives, but their entire understanding of their family history and their place in the community. Mom's father, my grandfather who died when I was 15, had not been the war hero and community leader she'd always claimed he was. In fact, military records showed he'd never served overseas, had been discharged for disciplinary issues, and had spent the last years of his life involved in financial schemes that had cost several local families their life savings. The family story we'd all grown up with, the foundation of Mom's identity and social standing, the reason she'd always felt superior to other families in the community, it was all completely false. And the documentation I'd found proved not just that she'd been wrong about her father's history, but that she'd known the truth for years and had actively maintained the lie. This wasn't something I could reveal gradually or anonymously. This required a more public forum, a more dramatic revelation, a moment when the entire community would understand exactly who my mother really was and what she was capable of. I started planning for the annual Veterans Day ceremony, where Mom had been scheduled to give a speech honoring her father's service and sacrifice. She did this every year, and every year the community gathered to hear her talk about the hero who'd raised her and the values he'd instilled in their family. This year was going to be different. This year, the community was going to learn the truth about heroes and liars, and the daughters who inherit both legacies. As I sat in my Minneapolis apartment that night, reviewing the documentation that would destroy my mother's reputation and social standing, I felt something I hadn't felt since that day in December, a sense of complete clarity about who I was and what I was capable of. They'd wanted me to disappear quietly, to accept their version of reality, to continue being the accommodating daughter who absorbed their cruelty without consequences. Instead, they were about to discover that the daughter they discarded was far more dangerous than the one they'd tried to keep. 3 months after I'd left Cedar Falls, my family's world started collapsing in ways they hadn't anticipated, and I watched it happen from 250 miles away with the detached fascination of someone observing a controlled demolition. Jake's divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in March, and by that evening, he was calling everyone in the family trying to figure out how Ashley had gotten access to information that should have been private. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jake, who had spent months sharing my private information with my ex-husband, was now furious about his own privacy being violated. Ashley had been thorough in her divorce proceedings, I'll give her that. She'd hired a forensic accountant who'd uncovered every hidden debt, every secret transaction, every lie Jake had told about their financial situation. The gambling addiction alone had cost them over $40,000, but the emotional infidelity and the dating app activity had cost him any chance of a sympathetic hearing from the judge. He lost the house, half his retirement savings, and had to pay Ashley's legal fees. More importantly, he'd lost his reputation in their small community, where word of his gambling and cheating had spread through social media and gossip networks with the speed that only small-town scandals can achieve. But the real devastation was still coming for him, and he had no idea. I discovered something about Jake's relationship with Marcus that went beyond simple friendship, beyond even the betrayal of sharing my private information. Through careful investigation and some strategic conversations with mutual acquaintances, I'd learned that Jake and Marcus had been business partners in a side venture that Jake had never disclosed to Ashley during their marriage. They'd been flipping houses together, using Jake's contracting connections and Marcus's real estate license to buy, renovate, and sell properties for profit. It was actually a smart business model, except for 2 problems. Jake had been using marital assets to fund his portion of the investments without Ashley's knowledge, and they hadn't been properly reporting their profits for tax purposes. The business partnership explained so much about Jake's loyalty to Marcus during my divorce. It wasn't just friendship, it was financial entanglement. Jake couldn't afford to alienate Marcus because they were making real money together, money that Jake needed to cover his gambling losses and maintain the lifestyle Ashley expected. When I made an anonymous call to the IRS about potential unreported income from property transactions, I wasn't just destroying Jake's secret business venture. I was unraveling a financial conspiracy that implicated both my brother and my ex-husband in tax fraud. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Both men lost their licenses, Jake's contracting license and Marcus's real estate license, and faced significant fines and potential criminal charges. The house-flipping business collapsed overnight, leaving them both financially devastated and legally compromised. Marcus called me exactly once during this period, leaving a voicemail that was equal parts pleading and threatening. He wanted to know if I was behind the investigations into their business, wanted to negotiate some kind of truce, wanted to convince me that destroying Jake wouldn't heal whatever pain I was feeling from our divorce. He was wrong about my motivations, but right about the consequences. Destroying Jake wasn't about healing my pain. It was about ensuring that people who betrayed trust faced appropriate consequences for their choices. I never called Marcus back, but I did save his voicemail. Someday, when enough time had passed, I might send it to his next girlfriend as a warning about what kind of man she was dating. Dad's business continued to struggle as word spread about his cash payment practices and potential tax issues. The contracting industry is built on reputation and trust, and once people start questioning your honesty about one thing, they start questioning everything. Former clients began asking uncomfortable questions about permits, insurance, and whether their own renovations had been done legally. The IRS audit that followed my anonymous tip about his unreported income was comprehensive and expensive. Dad ended up owing significant back taxes and penalties, which forced him to sell equipment and take out loans against the house to cover his debt. The financial stress was affecting his health, his marriage, and his ability to maintain the comfortable retirement he and Mom had been planning. But Dad's consequences were nothing compared to what was coming for Mom. The prescription drug investigation had been more successful than I'd anticipated. Not only had she lost access to multiple pill sources and been required to enter addiction treatment, but the investigation had uncovered evidence that she'd been forging prescriptions and potentially selling pills to other people in their community. Mom had become a small-time drug dealer without even realizing it. When friends and neighbors had complained about their own pain issues and difficulty getting adequate medication, she'd been sharing her supply, sometimes accepting money to cover the inconvenience of giving up pills she might need later. In her mind, she was being helpful and generous. In the eyes of the law, she was distributing controlled substances without a license. The criminal charges were filed on a Thursday morning in April, and by that afternoon, the local newspaper had picked up the story. "Local woman charged in prescription drug distribution scheme" was the headline that destroyed Mom's carefully maintained reputation as a pillar of the community. The shame was devastating for someone who'd built her identity around being respectable, reliable, and morally superior to other families who'd faced scandals over the years. Mom had always been the one organizing charity drives, volunteering at church functions, and giving subtle lectures about personal responsibility and family values. Now she was the one being whispered about in grocery store aisles and church pews. But I still wasn't finished with her. The Veterans Day revelation was still coming, and that would be the final blow to everything she'd used to define herself and her place in the world. Throughout all of this, my phone continued to ring with calls from family members who were increasingly desperate to reach me. Dad left voicemails that ranged from apologetic to angry to pleading. Mom's messages started as attempts to explain and justify their Christmas decision, then evolved into requests for help with her legal issues, and finally became emotional breakdowns where she sobbed about how everything was falling apart and she needed her daughter. Jake's calls were the most aggressive. He was convinced I was behind everything that was happening to their family, and he wasn't entirely wrong. But he couldn't prove it, and more importantly, he couldn't stop it. The investigations, legal proceedings, and community gossip had taken on a life of their own that was beyond anyone's ability to control. The beautiful thing about truth is that it doesn't require ongoing maintenance once it's been set free. Lies require constant energy to sustain, but facts just exist, creating consequences that flow naturally from the original deception. I never responded to any of their calls or messages. My silence was its own form of communication, a clear statement that they were no longer people I considered worth engaging with, that their problems were no longer my concern, that the daughter who had always tried to fix everything for everyone was permanently unavailable. Instead, I focused on building my new life in Minneapolis. I'd signed a lease on a larger apartment, made genuine friends at work, started dating a kind, stable man named David who knew nothing about my family drama and liked me exactly as I was. I was sleeping better than I had in years. My depression was manageable with medication and therapy, and for the first time since my divorce, I felt genuinely optimistic about my future. The contrast was stark and deliberate. While my family's lives were imploding under the weight of their own choices and deceptions, I was thriving in an environment where I was valued, supported, and free from the constant emotional manipulation I'd been enduring for years. But the final act of my revenge was still to come. Veterans Day was approaching, and Mom's annual speech honoring her father's military service was scheduled for November 11th at the community center. She'd been giving variations of the same speech for 15 years, and people in Cedar Falls looked forward to it as a highlight of the ceremony. This year, I was going to be in the audience. Not to reconcile or forgive or offer support during her legal troubles, but to bear witness to the moment when her last comfortable lie was exposed to everyone who'd ever believed her stories about family honor and moral superiority. The military records I'd obtained, the financial documents showing her father's scheme to defraud local families, the evidence that she'd known the truth for years and had deliberately maintained the fiction, all of it was going to become public knowledge at the moment when it would cause maximum damage to her reputation and social standing. Some people might call what I was planning cruel or excessive. I called it proportional justice. She destroyed my trust and my place in the family by systematically excluding me while pretending to care about my well-being. Now she was going to experience her own systematic exclusion from the community respect and social standing she'd built on lies. The only difference was her consequences were based on actual harm she'd done to real people, not just the inconvenience of loving a daughter who was going through a difficult time. Veterans Day 2022 was unseasonably warm for Iowa in November, and I sat in the back of the Cedar Falls Community Center wearing a black dress and sunglasses, looking like someone who'd come to pay respects rather than deliver a reckoning. Nobody recognized me at first. I'd lost weight since leaving town, changed my hair, and carried myself differently, with the confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of. The woman who'd driven away in tears 9 months earlier had been replaced by someone harder, clearer, more purposeful. The community center was packed, as it always was for the Veterans Day ceremony. This was one of the most important civic events of the year in Cedar Falls, drawing not just veterans and their families but also local politicians, business leaders, and anyone who wanted to be seen supporting the troops and honoring military service. Mom was seated in the front row, wearing her best navy blue suit and the American flag pin she always wore for patriotic occasions. She looked smaller than I remembered, older somehow, and I could see the toll that the past 9 months had taken on her. The criminal charges, the community gossip, the financial stress from Dad's business problems, all of it had aged her in ways that went beyond simple time. But she was still planning to give her speech about Grandpa William's heroic military service, still intending to trade on a reputation built on lies, still comfortable with using fake honor to maintain her standing in a community that was already questioning everything else about her character. That was about to change. The ceremony followed the same format it had used for years: opening remarks from the mayor, a performance by the high school choir, recognition of local veterans, and then the keynote address that Mom had delivered annually since 2007. People were used to her presentation about her father's service in World War II, his sacrifice for country and community, and the values he'd instilled in his family. I waited until she was introduced, and had stepped up to the podium before I stood up in the back of the room. The movement was subtle, but movement in a seated audience always draws attention. A few people turned to look at me, and I saw recognition dawn on some faces. Sarah Mitchell, the daughter who disappeared after Christmas, was back in town for Veterans Day. Mom saw me too, and for just a moment, her composure cracked completely. She gripped the podium with both hands and stared at me like she was seeing a ghost, which, in a way, she was. The accommodating daughter she'd tried to dismiss had died the day I read her letter. The woman standing in the back of that community center was someone entirely new. She tried to continue with her prepared remarks, but I could see her hands shaking as she shuffled her notes. Her voice wavered as she began the familiar story about Grandpa William's courage under fire, his leadership during the Battle of the Bulge, his medals for valor and sacrifice. I let her get about halfway through the speech before I spoke. My voice carried easily through the quiet room, clear and calm and completely devastating in its matter-of-factness. I said that I was sorry to interrupt, but I had some information about Grandpa William's military service that the community might find interesting. I said that as his granddaughter, I felt a responsibility to ensure that his memory was honored with truth rather than fiction. The room went completely silent. Not just quiet, but silent in the way that happens when something shocking and unprecedented is occurring and no one knows how to respond. Mom tried to regain control of the situation, telling me that this wasn't the time or place for family discussions, that we could talk after the ceremony. Her voice was high and tight with panic, and everyone could hear it. I ignored her completely and addressed the audience directly. I told them that military records showed William Mitchell had never served overseas during World War II. He'd been stationed stateside, had been discharged for disciplinary issues related to theft of military property, and had never received any medals for valor or heroism. I told them that after his discharge, he'd been involved in several financial schemes that had defrauded local families out of their life savings, including a fraudulent investment scheme that had targeted war widows and elderly residents. I told them that my mother had known these facts for years, had access to the military records and court documents that proved her father's actual history, but had chosen to maintain the fiction because it served her social and political purposes in the community. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. You could literally hear people breathing, the soft creak of folding chairs, the distant hum of the building's heating system. 200 people trying to process what they'd just heard and what it meant about someone they'd trusted and respected for decades. Mom tried to deny it, her voice getting higher and more desperate with each word. She called me vindictive, said I was lying, claimed I was trying to hurt the family because of some personal grudge related to my divorce. That's when I pulled out the manila folder I'd been carrying. I told the audience that I had copies of military records, court documents, and financial records for anyone who wanted to verify what I'd just shared. I said I'd also brought copies of correspondence showing that Mom had requested these same documents from the military archives 15 years ago, proving that she'd known the truth long before she started giving speeches about her father's heroic service. The mayor tried to regain control of the ceremony, suggesting that we table this discussion and continue with the planned program. But the damage was done, and everyone knew it. The murmur of voices was starting to rise as people began talking to each other, asking questions, demanding to see the documents I'd mentioned. I walked down the center aisle toward the front of the room, and people moved aside to let me pass. The folder felt light in my hands, but I knew its contents were heavy enough to destroy everything Mom had built her identity on. When I reached the front, I set the folder on the table next to the podium and told Mom that everything she needed to finally tell the truth about her father was right there. I told her she could continue lying, but now everyone would know that's what she was doing. Then I walked back up the aisle and out of the community center, leaving behind a room full of people who were just beginning to understand how thoroughly they'd been deceived by someone they'd trusted completely. I didn't stay to see what happened next. I didn't need to. Truth has its own momentum once it's been released, and the consequences would unfold naturally from there. But I did drive by the community center about an hour later, and the parking lot was still full. People weren't ready to go home yet, weren't ready to pretend they hadn't just witnessed the complete destruction of someone's public reputation and social standing. Mom's car was still there too, which meant she was probably still inside, still trying to explain or justify or minimize what had just happened. Still trying to maintain some version of the lie that had just been exposed to everyone who mattered in her community. I felt a moment of something that might have been pity, but it passed quickly. She'd made her choices, to exclude me, to share my private pain with my abuser, to build her reputation on lies while judging other people for their moral failings. Every consequence she was facing was the direct result of decisions she'd made freely and maintained consistently over years. As I drove back toward Minneapolis that evening, my phone started buzzing with calls from local numbers I didn't recognize. Word was spreading fast, and people wanted more details, more documents, more evidence of what else the Mitchell family might have been lying about. I didn't answer any of the calls. My work was done, and the rest would happen without my involvement. The daughter they dismissed as too needy, too emotional, too much trouble to love unconditionally had just systematically dismantled everything they'd used to define themselves and their place in the world. And I was driving toward a life I'd built entirely on my own, surrounded by people who valued me exactly as I was, free from the toxic dynamics that had nearly destroyed my sense of self-worth. They'd wanted a Christmas without me. Now they had a life without me and all the consequences that came with that choice. It was exactly what they'd asked for. 2 years later, I married David in a small ceremony in Minneapolis, surrounded by friends who'd never met my biological family and didn't need to understand the complicated history that had brought me to that moment. If you've ever built a completely new life from the ashes of betrayal, you know how surreal it feels to stand in a place of genuine happiness and remember the person you used to be. The woman who'd walked into that empty house on December 23, 2021, expecting to find family and finding rejection instead, felt like someone I'd read about rather than someone I'd been. Grandma Rose was the only family member I invited to the wedding, and at 90, she made the trip to Minneapolis with the help of a private care aide I'd hired for her. She looked elegant in the lavender dress I'd bought for her, and when she walked me down the aisle, I felt the presence of the only unconditional love I'd ever known from my biological family. She'd moved out of my parents' house 6 months after the Veterans Day incident, using money from the sale of some property she'd inherited to secure a place in an assisted living facility about an hour from Cedar Falls. She told me she couldn't continue living with people who'd treated their daughter the way they'd treated me, and that at her age, she was too tired to pretend that what they'd done was forgivable. Her decision to leave had been the final blow to my parents' social standing in the community. When the matriarch of the family publicly distanced herself from her own son and daughter-in-law, it confirmed what many people had suspected, that the problems in the Mitchell family went much deeper than one daughter's vindictive behavior at a Veterans Day ceremony. I'd kept in touch with developments in Cedar Falls through Grandma and through mutual acquaintances who were happy to share updates about my family's continued downward spiral. The information came to me naturally, without effort, like updates on characters in a television show I'd stopped watching but still heard about occasionally. Dad's business had never recovered from the tax issues and reputation damage. He'd been forced to declare bankruptcy and take a job working for another contractor, essentially starting over at 63 years old. The stress had affected his health, high blood pressure, heart problems, the kind of physical breakdown that happens when financial and emotional pressure becomes unbearable. Mom had pled guilty to the prescription drug charges and received probation along with mandatory addiction treatment and community service. The criminal record made it impossible for her to continue the volunteer work that had been central to her identity and the community service requirement. Picking up trash along county roads was a daily reminder of how far she'd fallen from her previous status. But the real punishment was social. Cedar Falls is a small community where reputation matters, and once someone's credibility is destroyed, it's nearly impossible to rebuild. Mom had spent years positioning herself as morally superior to other families who'd faced scandals, and the community had long memories about that kind of judgment. She'd become what she'd always feared most, the subject of gossip, speculation, and social exclusion. The woman who'd once organized charity drives and given speeches about family values was now the cautionary tale other parents used to warn their children about the dangers of prescription drug abuse and the importance of honesty. Jake had moved away from Iowa entirely after his divorce was finalized, reportedly living somewhere in Arizona and working construction jobs that paid cash under the table. The criminal charges related to the house-flipping business had been resolved with fines and restitution, but his credit was destroyed and his professional licenses were permanently revoked. Ashley had remarried within 18 months, choosing a man who was everything Jake had pretended to be: financially stable, emotionally available, genuinely committed to building a family. She'd gotten pregnant almost immediately, and from what I heard, she was living the life she'd thought she was building with my brother. Marcus had fared slightly better, managing to rebuild his real estate career in a different state where his reputation wasn't completely destroyed. But the financial losses from the failed business venture and the legal fees had set him back significantly, and he was reportedly still paying restitution related to the tax fraud charges. The most satisfying part of these updates wasn't the evidence of their suffering. It was the knowledge that every consequence they faced was the direct result of choices they'd made freely and maintained consistently over time. I hadn't invented their lies, their betrayals, their illegal activities, or their moral failings. I'd simply stopped protecting them from the natural consequences of their own behavior. They'd expected me to continue being the accommodating daughter who absorbed their cruelty without retaliation, who prioritized family harmony over personal justice, who would always forgive and forget because that's what good daughters do. Instead, they discovered that unconditional love has conditions, and they'd exceeded all of them. My new life in Minneapolis was everything my old life in Denver had been trying to become. David was a pediatric physician who understood the demands of healthcare work and the importance of genuine partnership in marriage. He knew about my family history, the broad strokes anyway, but he never pushed for details or suggested that I needed to reconcile with people who'd harmed me deliberately. We bought a house in a neighborhood full of young professionals and growing families, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names and looked out for each other's children. I'd made friends who invited me to book clubs and dinner parties and weekend trips, people who valued my presence rather than tolerating it. At work, I'd been promoted to charge nurse and was being encouraged to pursue additional certifications that would advance my career. My colleagues respected my clinical judgment, appreciated my leadership during difficult shifts, and sought out my opinion on patient care decisions. I was valued for my competence rather than managed for my emotional needs. The contrast with my previous life was so stark that sometimes I felt like I was living someone else's story. The woman who'd been told she was too needy, too emotional, too much trouble to include in family celebrations was now someone others turned to for stability and support during crisis situations. But the most profound change was internal. The depression that had nearly overwhelmed me during my divorce was manageable now, controlled with medication and therapy, but no longer defining my daily experience. The anxiety that had made me constantly worry about other people's reactions to my presence had been replaced by a quiet confidence in my own worth and judgment. I slept well at night, not because my problems had disappeared, but because I'd learned to solve them rather than endure them. I ate meals because I enjoyed food rather than because I needed to maintain my strength for other people's emotional demands. I made plans for the future because I believed I deserved to have one. The wedding itself was exactly what I'd wanted. Intimate, joyful, focused on the people who'd chosen to be part of our life together rather than those who'd been assigned to us by genetics. David's family had embraced me completely, never making me feel like I needed to explain or justify my estrangement from my biological relatives. His mother had walked me down the aisle alongside Grandma Rose, both of them understanding that family is created through love and choice rather than blood and obligation. The ceremony was officiated by a friend from work, and our vows focused on building something new together rather than healing from something old. After the ceremony, as we danced to music we'd chosen because we loved it rather than because it met someone else's expectations, I caught sight of Grandma Rose sitting at her table, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since before that December, when everything changed. She looked proud, and not just of the woman I'd become, but of the choices I'd made to get there. She understood better than anyone what it had cost me to walk away from family, and she also understood why it had been necessary. Later that evening, she pulled me aside for a private conversation that I'll remember for the rest of my life. She told me that she was proud of me for refusing to accept love that came with conditions, for insisting on being valued rather than tolerated, for building a life that honored my worth rather than apologizing for my existence. She told me that watching me create happiness from the ashes of betrayal had given her hope that it's never too late to choose authenticity over accommodation, truth over peace, justice over forgiveness. She told me that she'd spent too many years protecting people from the consequences of their own choices, and that seeing me refuse to do the same had inspired her to finally prioritize her own well-being over family harmony. Most importantly, she told me that she was sorry it had taken a crisis for her to find the courage to choose me over the people who'd hurt me, but that she was grateful the crisis had happened because it had shown her who I really was and who she wanted to be. We both cried, but they were tears of gratitude rather than grief, recognition rather than loss, hope rather than regret. 3 months after my wedding, I got a call from my father. I almost didn't answer. I'd been no contact with my parents for over 2 years, and seeing his name on my phone felt like encountering a ghost from a life I'd deliberately left behind. But curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up on the 4th ring. His voice was older, shakier than I remembered, and he sounded tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. He told me he was calling to apologize, to try to make amends, to see if there was any possibility of rebuilding our relationship. He said they'd all learned from what had happened, that they understood now how badly they'd hurt me, that they'd been in family therapy trying to understand where they'd gone wrong. He said they missed me, that holidays and family gatherings felt incomplete without me, that they'd realized too late how much they'd valued my presence in their lives. I listened to the entire speech without interrupting, and when he finished, I told him the truth as clearly and kindly as I could. I told him that I appreciated his apology, but that apologies don't erase consequences or undo harm. I told him that I'd spent 2 years building a life that didn't include them, and that I was genuinely happy with the choice I'd made. I told him that they'd shown me who they really were when they decided I was too much trouble to love unconditionally, and that I believed them the first time. I told him that the daughter, who'd been willing to forgive anything to maintain family relationships, had died the day I read Mom's letter, and that the woman I'd become wasn't interested in rebuilding relationships with people who'd deliberately chosen to harm her. Most importantly, I told him that I wished them well, that I hoped they'd learn to treat other people with more kindness and respect, but that their growth and healing was no longer my responsibility or concern. When I hung up, I felt nothing but peace. No guilt about refusing reconciliation, no sadness about maintaining estrangement, no regret about the family relationships I'd chosen to end. Instead, I felt profound gratitude for the clarity that betrayal had given me, the strength that abandonment had taught me, and the wisdom that comes from learning to value yourself enough to walk away from people who don't. That evening, David and I made dinner together in our kitchen while music played in the background, and our dog lay on his bed nearby, content and secure. We talked about our work, our plans for the weekend, a vacation we were considering for the fall. Normal, peaceful conversation between two people who'd chosen each other and continued choosing each other every day. Later, as we sat on our couch reading different books but sharing the same space, I realized that this was what happiness looked like, not the absence of problems, but the presence of people who face them with you rather than create them for you. The family I'd been born into had taught me what love looked like when it came with conditions, when it was withdrawn as punishment, when it was used as a weapon to control behavior and maintain power dynamics. The family I'd chosen had taught me what love looked like when it was freely given, consistently maintained, and based on genuine appreciation for who I was rather than expectations of who I should become. The difference between the two had been worth every painful step it had taken to move from one to the other. If you're watching this from a place where you're being told that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, that you should forgive and forget because that's what good daughters or sons or siblings do, I want you to know something. Family is only everything if it's built on love rather than obligation, respect rather than control, appreciation rather than tolerance. And if the people who share your DNA are treating your love like an inconvenience, your pain like a burden, and your presence like a problem to be solved, you have permission to walk away. You have permission to build something better. You have permission to choose people who choose you back. The life I built from the ashes of their betrayal became everything I'd never known I deserved, and it was worth every moment of the pain it took to get here. Sometimes the best revenge isn't making them pay for what they took from you. It's building something so beautiful from the pieces they left behind that you realize what they took was never worth keeping anyway. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here with me in this moment, for sharing this journey, for understanding that sometimes love means knowing when to walk away. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and whether this story resonated with your own experiences. Share it with someone who might need to hear that they deserve better than conditional love and emotional manipulation disguised as family loyalty. And remember, the family you choose is just as real as the family you're born into. Sometimes more real, because it's based on who you actually are rather than who you're supposed to be. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about choosing yourself, building something beautiful from betrayal, and learning that the best revenge is a life so good that you forget why you needed revenge in the first place. The woman who drove away from that empty house on December 23, 2021, thought she'd lost everything. The woman I am now knows that I'd actually found the beginning of everything. And that makes all the difference.